So what I'd like to cover today is I'll give you a really quick snapshot of land use and groundwater in our basin overall, and some of the questions we've been raising on governance in general as it relates to basin users. And then I'll spend most of my time just talking about the actual case study in our Paso Basin. And then we'll talk just one slide on looking forward and next steps. I do want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, jdiodati, who was instrumental in leading parts of the case study and for his contributions. So let me start off just by showing you, framing where we are in the state. So we're about 3.5 hours south of San Francisco along the Central Coast. This is San Luis Obispo County. It's roughly 330 square miles and has about 275,000 people. It's a very small population for a very large area, and it's predominantly rural and agricultural lands. When we talk about land use, it's much like anywhere else. We're looking at some of the major water user groups, the rural, the urban, the agricultural, and the environmental. And so just to help you get a sense of our county's makeup, I wanted to run through a couple quick snapshots. So this is looking at the urban or larger populous areas throughout our county. You can see there's not that many throughout the county, and these range anywhere from about 2,000 people up to 60,000. So pretty small centers. And this is our both irrigated and non-irrigated agricultural lands as of, I believe this was in 2012. And this is a snapshot of our rural domestic users in the orange, and then the gray lands being vacant rural lands. And then, of course, we always need to consider the environmental and ecosystem needs. Our county's been working on getting a better understanding of that, so this water use continues to be better understood over time. And what's interesting to note is that a lot of these water users are either solely dependent on groundwater or largely dependent on groundwater. So here's just a map of our county and the 22 groundwater basins throughout our area. A lot of these are small coastal aquifers, and then we do have some larger basins, which when SGMA went into effect, the state did prioritize 5 of our basins as being either high or medium priorities, and that's based on the relatively large population served and their reliance on groundwater in general. So I'll be focusing most of my talk today up on that upper northeast corner basin. It's the Paso Basin, part of the Salinas Valley. But I did just want to give you a flavor of how many different basins we're trying to deal with in our county and the variability of what's going on in all of those areas. So this is just to kind of show you those areas, and if we have time at the end, we can talk more about those. But as we look at governance in those areas, and I think Anchor kind of talked about this idea that no one size fits all, really what we see as we work through any of those 5 basins is that we have a highly variable amount of technical studies that have been done in any given basin. We have differing demographics and water use in any given basin. Though they're largely ag, urban, and rural, the amounts of those change and the types of agriculture change basin to basin. And then, of course, we have differing basin conditions. So in the Paso Basin and Coyama Basin, we have significantly declining groundwater levels and quality issues, whereas in Los Osos Basin, we have seawater intrusion. So just a lot of different ideas or issues we're trying to work around. And then in all the basins, we also have varying levels of engagement and management. And so how do we work around that when we start thinking about governance? Really, what the law did in terms of being helpful, it did notice who are eligible agencies to form a GSA. So we know we can have local public agencies. That's counties, cities, community services districts, special water districts or California water districts and others, and also certain private water purveyors. The law also says that that group, whoever forms the GSA, will need to consider basin users. It's not very specific about how to do that, and in our area, that's a big area of concern then, because some of our largest water users and groundwater reliant folks fall within this basin user category and aren't necessarily represented well in the eligible agencies. So one of the big things I'm working on with my team over the next year is finding what GSA governance structure works best, what decision-making and engagement is fair and equitable, and then also underpinning that, what resources and funding needs to be made available in order to keep that GSA actually effective in what it does moving ahead. So I think we've heard about that a lot over the last couple days. And when I'm looking at, like I said, we have some of these basin users that may not be well represented. So we need to start working with them to understand what would a good representation look like then. So when we talk about maybe the agricultural users, do they just want to be engaged on an individual basis through stakeholder engagement? Or is there some way of bringing them in an advisory or representative mode on a GSA or otherwise? And so we kind of have this full scale, and I think a lot of this deals with where their trust lies and where they think they might be well represented. So that leads into the case study of the Salinas Valley and specifically the Paso Basin, sub-basin within there. So you saw this map earlier. It's roughly 750 square miles basin, very large. It's all part of this larger Salinas Valley groundwater basin. So our headwaters are down here in the south end, but it's roughly 160 miles long, moving up through Monterey County into the Pacific Ocean, and involves a number of sub-basins. So a lot of coordination happening throughout the whole basin. And just as a framework, when we talk about governance, there has been a significant amount of technical studies done. So there is like a really good understanding of the basin conditions in the Paso Basin and also the larger Salinas Valley. So I just called out some of the recent studies over the last 15 years, starting with basin characterizations, building a groundwater flow model, conducting banking studies and looking at the different feasibility of supply options throughout the basin. And then on top of all these studies, there's also been this voluntary move towards groundwater management planning several years ago and formation of stakeholder advisory groups. So like I said, this is one of those basins with the highly engaged and highly studied area. But early on, or over the last couple years rather, the stakeholders recognized that maybe they didn't have an entity that was willing to step into the role of doing the management actions necessary. They didn't know whether or not the county would actually step up and do that for them since they're largely unincorporated parts of the county. And so the stakeholders worked with Assemblyman Achadjian and the legislature to approve what's called Assembly Bill 2453. And that was essentially a hybrid special act water district. So kind of like a California water district, but slightly different. And I'll go through the nuances of it later, but it was intended to be representative of the basin water uses. Meanwhile, though, just about as that special act district was coming about, SGMA was signed into effect by the governor. So they literally came out within months of each other. And what's beneficial was they're really closely aligned because they were being drafted at the same time. A lot of the special act water district includes powers that a GSA would have and is really formed for a very similar purpose to the groundwater management entities. And then coming out of SGMA, of course, this basin was then classified as a high priority basin and was also deemed to be in a condition of critical overdraft, which meant that this basin has an expedited compliance timeframe. And at the same time, also litigation was initiated here. So a quiet title process was initiated. So all this to say, there's a lot happening in this basin all at once. So here's the basin again, and now I just wanted to point out the eligible entities. So when we talk about a GSA, all the blue areas here are specific smaller, either special purpose or city areas that are eligible to be on a GSA, and then the larger white area is really either county lands and could be represented by the county, or is unincorporated and needs some other entity. And that's where AB 2453 came in. That was the water district was intended to become that new representation over the white area. And so this is just to give you an idea of what that governance structure looked like. So a lot of the agriculture, the pumping there is done in agriculture. It's something like 80% of pumping in this basin is done by agriculture. And then we have a large domestic rural use. So the board that they came up with for this new water district is a 9-member board, and it's intended to cover both of those representative uses. We have 3 registered voter seats voted on by registered voters and filled by them. And then there were 6 landowner vote seats on the board of directors. And so these range from small landowners under 40 acres of land to medium landowners from 40 to 400 acres, and then to our large landowners, which cover over 400 acres of land. And so what you're seeing here is just an attempt at ensuring that there are all the voices at the table on the governance structure. And don't worry, I won't go through all of this, but something in California that we have to do when we form new local agencies is go through the local agency formation commission process. And so this is just to give you a snapshot of really what happened. And the idea behind this process is to have a public vetting of forming new agencies and making sure that they actually will be effective and are needed in an area. So that started in late 2014 and really went on until the recent elections in March 8th, 2016. And the intent of pushing it so quickly through all these public hearings was to make sure that if the water district were to form after its election process, then they would be ready to be involved in the GSA formation process. And so kind of the first step, in case anyone here is thinking about forming a new entity, the first step we had to do was come up with a plan for services and a formation application. So this talks about the boundaries of the new entity and the powers that that entity would have. It also lines out a 5-year operating budget for a new entity, and then talks about potential funding mechanisms. And then we went through the LAFCO process, and at the end of it, after having, I believe, 3 study sessions and several public hearings that sometimes had over 400 stakeholders involved in them, at the final end of that process, they said this water district can move forward through its election process with conditions of approval. It has to pass the voter and landowner formation process, and then it also needs to pass the SGMA compliance funding aspect. And so that was our next big hurdle is, can we pass funding for a new water district? So because the water district does not actually exist yet, the county took on the role of conducting what's called the Proposition 218 proceedings, so essentially setting up the funding mechanism. In the end, we selected a special tax as the best mode to do this, and then we looked at the costs of operating a water district and came up with roughly $950,000 per year to do monitoring, admin, and planning efforts over the next 5 years. What we wanted to do was, again, come up with kind of a hybrid approach. How do you make this a fair funding vote? We don't have metered groundwater wells, so how do you ensure that those using the basin are the ones taking on more of the cost? So what we did was a formula that basically had one flat rate over the entire basin for all the parcels, and that was because all basin users have to comply with SGMA, so we thought there is some benefit to everyone. And then the next part of that component was looking at by land use. So if you have a single family residence, you're paying slightly lower than if you have multiple family residences on a parcel, and so on. And then there was the last component, which is where you get your largest funding base, and that's getting funding based on acreage. That's how we estimate water demand, is both land use and acreage. So here we have about 25 cents per acre to non-irrigated users, and then $18 per acre to the irrigated users. And what you're seeing here is that the 77%, we're having our largest generation of funding by the actual irrigators of the basin is the hope there. And at the bottom, I just have this fun fact that approximately 60% of the single-family residences paid $37.50 or less per year. So the intent there was, again, equity, making sure those who use less pay less. We did significant outreach over the last year and a half. We outreached to over 1,700 individuals, and keep in mind there's only 7,200 registered voters. So reached out to a lot of people. There were 8 televised meetings and public hearings. There were several public forums and candidate forums, multiple ads through the radio and the TV. We also had direct mailers going out to folks and endorsements from big organizations. And then a grassroots approach where there were yes, vote on this, or no, don't vote on this, yard signs all over the basin. So word was getting out, and we feel like people really did understand their options of this water district as a form of representation. So how did it turn out on March 8th of this year? I am really pleased to say that I think given the outreach and the level of engagement, we had a really high turnout. We had over 60%, which is really uncommon for election processes. And so the water district formation vote, whether or not they actually wanted this as their form of representation, 73% no, and 27% yes. So that did not pass. And then the SGMA funding, so compliance, whether it was the county or this new entity, was 77% no and 23% yes. So neither passed, and I don't say that to depress you. I just, I think this is a very important lessons learned as we're moving forward with governance, that really, I think this has to be an iterative process. There was something about that people did not like. Unfortunately, I don't have surveys of the voters when they went to the polls, but I think a lot of people don't want a tax, and so there needs to be better understanding of what they're getting out of this. So just keeping that in mind, that it is going to be a challenge to fund groundwater, as we've heard over and over again. There's also that question of how this plays into or harms property rights and water rights, and that's a big concern amongst farmers and rural users. And then there's this public perception of some people kind of just want to see, will the state come in? You know, and I have heard that from people. They don't necessarily believe it. So they're not sure that it warrants them actually taking action. But looking ahead, I think what'll be really important is I'll be working with my team and all the agencies and stakeholders through a state facilitator to open up that dialogue again, find out what really happened, and find out what they think will be fair representation throughout the basin. And it may take being more innovative in their approach. You know, that was one option for governance, but maybe the people on the board or the idea wasn't trusted by folks around the basin. So we need to just keep, like I said, iteratively changing the makeup of a board and seeing what will work best. I do want to caution everyone, you know, not to rush the process. I know there are deadlines and there's the potential of state intervention, but I think it's important to really make sure that we come up with a well-trusted and effective governance structure and aim to meet deadlines, but make sure we don't undercut the process along the way. And I would just caution you all, or not caution you, but encourage you all to go out and just keep building trust with your communities and between all the partner agencies. And with that happy thought, I will close up, and here's all my contact information if you wanted to hear about this anymore.
Question?
Could you have separated the two votes? In other words, had the vote for the special district first and then the Sigma funding second, and do you think that might have helped the process?
You know, that's a great question, and we actually struggled with that, mainly, you know, given that it had a lot to do with that timing aspect. We knew that if a water district were formed, it would need funding, and that didn't exist otherwise. But also, we didn't want to slow down either process because we wanted to make sure that if it were to form, that they would have enough time to actually become a part of a GSA. Because remember, this was really just to give them a seat at the table. They wouldn't necessarily be the GSA itself, but it was just to get them eligible to be at that table. But yeah, you're right. That was something we talked a lot about was, you know, there was a confusion. Some voters received 4 different ballots because they were getting landowner, registered voter, and then separate landowner vote ballots.
Do you think if Sigma had passed prior to your work to form an agency and to get the legislation, all that, that maybe things would have turned out differently? In other words, you already had Sigma before the process started.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure. I think it was helpful having Sigma there because it was a state mandated regulation. So I think it really just helped to be supportive. It was saying, you know, if you don't have this this entity or some other entity that's eligible, you may not have a seat at the table unless you're okay with the county being at the table for you. And so I think it kind of went hand in hand, but it didn't pass. So I'm not, you know, it's a little hard to speak to why people did that, and I don't live in the basin, so I'm not too sure. But good questions, yeah.
All right, thanks, Carolyn.